frost came down hard the night before. You can see it now, in the early grey of a spring morning in northern France, white on the grass, white on the mud, white on the warped shingles of a small timber church that has been standing on this hill for 200 years and is, by any honest assessment, falling apart. Stand here for a moment. Feel the cold. The sun is not yet fully up, just a pale suggestion of light in the east, barely enough to see by, and the air smells of wood smoke drifting up from the town below, from the bread bakers and the smiths and the households coming alive in the valley. Somewhere further, just at the edge of hearing, monastery bells. Not the great bells of ceremony, just the small rhythmic call to morning prayer, thin and clear in the frozen air. This hill is not spectacular. That's the first thing to understand. It does not crown a mountain. It commands no dramatic cliff. It is a modest rise, a gentle elevation above the valley floor, the kind of place a farmer notices without thinking about it, useful for spotting weather, useful for being seen. And that, precisely, is the point. From the river, you can see this hill. From the farms stretching out to the north and east, you can see this hill. Walk 2 days in almost any direction, and at some point, on a clear day, you will turn, and this hill will still be visible on the horizon. Whoever chose it knew what they were doing. Below the valley, if you look carefully, you can still make out the line of a Roman road, older than the church, older than the town, older than anyone alive can remember. It does not follow the hill. It cuts straight through the valley in the way Roman roads always do, indifferent to local geography, indifferent to local preferences, interested only in the shortest line between 2 distant imperial points. The old world is literally underfoot here, still there, still usable. And then there is the church itself. A single crow sits on its roof this morning, just the one. The timber is warped from 2 centuries of rain and frost, the planks pulling apart at their joints, the whole structure tilting very slightly to the north as though leaning into the prevailing wind out of old habit. Go inside, or imagine going inside, and the smell hits you immediately. Tallow, damp wool, old smoke from a fire that has never quite managed to warm the space. The stone altar is stained. The wooden saints along the wall are soft with rot in their bases. Candles burn anyway. They burn because they always burn, because someone's grandmother lit a candle here, and her grandmother before that. This church has been holy for 200 years. It will be holy for exactly a little longer, because 3 years ago, the bishop began asking questions. Then he began asking for money. Then he convened the chapter, the assembled clergy of this diocese, and the debates that followed were long and occasionally bitter, about cost, about ambition, about the proper scale of human devotion made stone. 3 years of that, 3 years of argument in candlelit rooms, of letters sent to Rome and other bishops, of careful accountings written in careful hands. The chapter finally gave its approval. Not everyone was enthusiastic, not everyone believed it was possible, but the approval came. And so this morning, on this cold hill, with frost on the ground and a crow on a rotting roof and monastery bells still fading in the valley air, something is ending. The small timber church has done its work. It has held the prayers of this community through plague years and harvest failures, through wars that came and went and came again. It has been enough. It is no longer enough. What is about to begin on this hill will take longer than a human life to complete, longer than 2 human lives. The men who will break the first ground, who will mix the first mortar, who will set the first cut stones in place, almost none of them will see what this becomes. Their sons may not see it. Their grandsons may stand inside something that is still not finished. This is not unusual. This is, in fact, the defining condition of what is about to begin, because what this hill is about to become is not just a building. It is one of the most complex construction projects in human history, undertaken without cranes, without steel, without computers, without a single engineering calculation written in the mathematical notation we would recognize, undertaken by men who learned their craft by watching other men, who carried their knowledge in their hands and their eyes, who were solving problems that had never been solved before, problems they did not fully understand until the walls started cracking, or the roof started moving, or the stone started telling them, in its slow and unignorable way, that they had made a mistake.
The crow lifts from the roof. It circles once. It goes.
The frost will melt by mid-morning. The mud beneath will be ankle-deep.
And somewhere in that mud, below the boots of a bishop and a chapter and a master builder who has not yet arrived, something is waiting to begin.
So who decides to build a cathedral? Not God, not the people who will pray in it for the next 4 centuries, not the masons who will spend their lives cutting its stone. The decision is made by men with land and money and ambition, men who speak constantly in the language of heaven and operate continuously in the logic of earth. Understanding how this decision gets made, how it moves from vague aspiration to broken ground, means understanding something uncomfortable about the medieval church. It was not separate from political power. It was political power, wearing vestments. Begin with the bishop. The bishop is a feudal lord. This is not a metaphor. He holds land granted by the crown, sometimes tens of thousands of acres, producing rents and harvests and timber rights and mill fees. He commands legal courts with jurisdiction over vast populations. He levies taxes. In some dioceses, he fields armed retainers. He attends councils of war alongside counts and dukes because the church he governs is one of the largest landholders in the kingdom. His spiritual authority and his secular authority are not 2 different things awkwardly combined. They are one thing, fused at the root, each drawing power from the other. When he kneels to pray in the morning, and he does kneel, many bishops are genuinely devout, he rises from that prayer to manage something closer to a small sovereign state than a spiritual calling. He is also, typically, old, 55, 60, sometimes older. Episcopal appointments were political negotiations that took time. The man who decides to build a cathedral has often been planning it for years before he had the authority to begin, and he is now, perhaps, running out of time to see it done. This is the question no one says aloud in the chapter house. Will he live to see this done? Not the finished building. No one expects that. Will he live to see the choir walls rise above the foundations? Will he consecrate the altar? The bishop is 58 years old, and he knows the number, and the number sits behind every decision he makes. Below the bishop, the cathedral chapter. The canons, the priests who serve the cathedral and govern its daily operations, are not subordinates in any simple sense. They are an independent power with their own land holdings, their own finances, their own internal hierarchies. They are prebendaries. Each canon holds a prebend, a specific piece of church property whose income funds his position. Some canons are wealthy. Some are connected to noble families who endow cathedral positions as a form of dynasty management, a way to keep sons in comfortable authority. The chapter debates, argues, votes. It has its own ambitions that are not always identical to the bishop's ambitions. A cathedral project requires their agreement, their money, their cooperation in ways that can be withdrawn, delayed, complicated. Nothing happens without the chapter. Everything happens slower because of the chapter.
And then there is the question of why now? Why this hill? Why this decade? Why this particular gathering of political will and economic capacity? The answer is almost always because something else ended.
At Chartres in 1134, the answer was fire. The old cathedral burned. This sounds like pure catastrophe. In the economy of medieval ecclesiastical power, it was something more complicated. Fire destroys. Fire also creates. A destroyed building is an opportunity to build a better one. The bishop, who inherits a burned cathedral, inherits a blank site, and crucially, a community in grief, in shock, in a state of emotional readiness that can be organized toward rebuilding. The pilgrims are still coming. The relics survived. The veil of the Virgin, the most treasured object in Chartres, the cloth said to have been worn by Mary at the Annunciation, survived the flames. 10,000 pilgrims a year came to see it. They brought money. They bought indulgences, made donations, purchased tokens. The relic was an economic engine wrapped in sanctity, and the destroyed cathedral had, in burning, created the architectural emergency that could justify asking for more money, more labour, more stone, something worthy of what this place held.
Here is where we have to name Abbot Suger, not a bishop, not in the direct chain that produces a cathedral, but the man whose ideas change what building one means. Suger of Saint-Denis outside Paris, rebuilding his own abbey church in the 1130s and 1140s, had arrived at a theological proposition that was also an architectural manifesto. Beauty, he argued, was not vanity. Light was not decoration. The physical experience of entering a space of overwhelming luminous beauty was itself a form of spiritual ascent. The soul, encountering the gorgeous, was drawn upward toward the divine source of all beauty. This was not a new idea. It had deep roots in Neoplatonic philosophy, in Pseudo-Dionysius, in Augustine. But Suger made it buildable. He made it a reason to spend money on coloured glass and soaring vaults and columns of unprecedented slenderness. He gave the ambition a theology. And so the decision to build a cathedral is made in 3 places simultaneously: in the candlelit chapter house, where canons argue over money and precedent and the size of their respective prebends; in Rome, through papal letters and legates who must approve, who have their own preferences and political considerations; and in the bishop's great hall, over wine and parchment, where the bishop and his advisers and perhaps a powerful noble patron map the outline of something that will outlast all of them. Something they want to build partly for God, partly for the diocese, partly for their own names carved in stone, if not in the building itself, then in the documents that authorize it. The sacred language is real. The earthly ambition is also real. They are not in conflict. They are the same decision, spoken in 2 different registers. Now someone has to actually build it. The decision has been made. The money, some of it, enough of it, for now, has been gathered. The site is chosen, the foundation stones quarried, the liturgical calendar consulted for an auspicious date to break ground. And at some point, in some negotiation that probably happened over several months, across several letters, through several intermediaries, a man arrives. He looks at the site. He asks questions. He pulls a roll of scraped parchment from a leather satchel and begins to draw. He has no degree. There is no institution that could have given him one. There are no architecture schools in the 12th century, no academies of engineering, no royal colleges of masonry. What this man knows, he knows because someone older showed him, and someone older showed that man, and the chain of transmission goes back through workshops and lodges and building sites to knowledge that is partly written, mostly not, and always embodied, carried in the hands, in the eye, in the trained instinct that looks at a stone arch under construction and knows, without calculation, whether it will hold. He is, in one body, a stonemason and a structural engineer, a geometer and a hydraulic planner, a labour manager and a materials procurement specialist, a negotiator, a draftsman, and something that approaches without quite being an artist. The medieval church did not have a word that captures all of this. They called him Magister Operis, the master of works. He is not from here. He is never from here. This is one of the defining facts about him. He is itinerant, peripatetic. a man who has spent years walking from one great building site to another, studying with his eyes what no textbook could have taught him. He has stood in the nave at Sens and paced out the proportions of the piers. He has craned his neck in the choir at Leon and traced the logic of the tribune gallery with his gaze until he understood not just what it looked like, but why. Why that height? Why that rhythm? What problem it was solving and what new problems it introduced. He has walked to Saint-Denis and stood in Suga's rebuilt choir and felt the light coming through the ambulatory windows like something dissolved rather than blocked, and he has thought, carefully, about how that was done. He stole with his eyes. This was not considered theft. This was education. His tools are few and precise: a compass, a square, a measuring rod calibrated to the local foot, which is not the same as the foot in the next diocese, which is not the same as the Roman foot, which introduces its own complications that he has learned to manage, and his judgment, not a tool he can set down, not a tool anyone can borrow, the thing that makes him worth the considerable sum he has negotiated for his contract, because he negotiates his own contract, payment in coin, in kind, in lodging, the right to take on his own apprentices, to run his own lodge, to make certain classes of decision without committee. The chapter and the bishop will argue with him about money throughout. He knows this. He has done this before.
He carries something else, a lodge book, a collection of drawings on scraped parchment, some in his own hand, some inherited from whoever trained him or whoever he worked under before he was ready to lead. Geometric figures, profiles of mouldings, solutions to structural problems that came up on another site, recorded so they need not be reinvented, proportional systems that produce pleasing arcades, stable vaults, columns that feel both slender and sufficient. We have, by extraordinary luck, something very like one of these books. A portfolio assembled by a man named Villard de Honnecourt, probably in the 13th century, survives in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. 33 parchment leaves, architectural drawings and geometric exercises and human figures and mechanical devices, and a wrestling man and a porcupine, and instructions for measuring the width of a river you cannot cross. It is a window into a master builder's mind, not a systematic treatise, not a textbook, but a working document, a memory aid, a personal archive of things worth keeping, practical, capacious, slightly chaotic, very human.
This is the mind that will design your cathedral.
He will probably not finish it. He knows this. The timelines involved, decades, sometimes more than a century, mean that a man who begins in his prime will die in harness, mid-project, with the nave still open to the sky and the west towers barely started. His successor will adjust his designs. His successor's successor will adjust them further, responding to new influences, new ambitions, new structural ideas that did not exist when the first stone was laid. The building that stands completed, if it is ever completed, will be the work of many minds, arguing silently across generations in stone.
He designs for his successor. He designs with this knowledge built into the design itself, setting up systems that can be continued, establishing proportional logics that another trained eye can read and extend, creating a grammar that future builders can speak even if they never met him. This is a kind of generosity that the modern world has very few equivalents for. To make something knowing you will not see it finished. To make it anyway. To make it so well that the man who finishes it, who may be born after you die, can feel the intention and honor it.
He is building for God, yes. The theology is real to him. He has heard Suga's argument in the stones of Saint-Denis and in every choir that followed, and he believes, in whatever way a practical man believes abstract things, that the space he is creating will do something to the souls that enter it. He is building for the dead, for the bishop who will be buried in the choir, for the canons who endowed the chapels, for the ancestors whose bones already lie here in the older church his new church is replacing, waiting to be enclosed again. He is building for something that does not yet exist, in a future he will not see,
for people whose names he cannot know. He picks up his compass. He begins.
He begins with a line.
Not a calculation, not a formula in the modern sense, not a page of figures, not anything you would recognize from an engineering textbook. A line, drawn in the dirt, or scratched into a plaster tracing floor, or scribed into a thin layer of gypsum laid over stone. A single line of known length. Everything. The height of the nave, the width of the aisles, the radius of the apse, the spacing of the piers, the geometry of the arch itself. Everything that will eventually rise 200 feet into the French sky will be derived from that line through a sequence of geometric operations so elegant they are almost musical. This is not a limitation he is working around. This is the method. This is the geometry of heaven, and he believes, with the quiet certainty of a man trained in it from boyhood, that it is not merely practical, but true. Consider the tools available to him: a straight edge, a compass, a length of rope that can be knotted and stretched and anchored and swung in arcs, and Roman numerals, which are almost useless for calculation. Try multiplying 247 by 43 and see how far you get. The Hindu-Arabic numerals that make arithmetic trivial, the ones you learned as a child, are not in common use in France in the 12th century. There are scholars who know them. They have not yet filtered down to building sites. And so the master builder does not calculate. He constructs, he derives, he draws, ad quadratum. The method is older than the cathedrals, older than Christianity, older than Rome. Take a square, draw its diagonal, use that diagonal as the side of a new square. You have just enlarged your square by a factor of the square root of 2. Not that he would name it that way, but he knows the relationship, has known it since his hands first learned to hold a compass, and you can continue this operation indefinitely, each square generating the next, each new square standing in a precise and computable relationship to the one before. The entire proportional system of the building can be generated this way. The width of the nave determines the width of the aisle. The width of the aisle determines the height of the arcade. The height of the arcade determines the height of the clerestory. Each proportion cascades from the first line he drew in the dirt. Change that first line and everything changes with it, but the relationships hold. The building is not a collection of measurements. It is a single geometric argument unfolding outward from a seed. And then the vesica piscis. 2 circles of equal radius, each passing through the other's center, overlapping. The shape they produce where they intersect, that pointed almond of space between them, is called the vesica piscis, the fish bladder, and it has been a sacred symbol for longer than anyone in the 12th century knows. But it is also, and this is the thing that makes a builder's chest tighten with something like awe, the geometric generator of the pointed arch. Draw those 2 circles, connect the upper and lower intersections. You have your arch. The degree of its point, how steeply it rises, depends on how much the circles overlap, and that can be varied, controlled, adjusted to the specific structural situation without abandoning the underlying geometric logic. The pointed arch is not merely more beautiful than the round arch. It is structurally superior in ways that the master builder knows in his hands without knowing why, cannot yet explain in the language of forces and vectors that will take another 600 years to develop. A round arch pushes its thrust outward along a gentle curve. A pointed arch redirects that thrust more steeply downward. The force that wants to buckle your wall inward or push it outward is instead aimed more directly at the ground, which is where you want it. The geometry is doing physics that no one has yet named.
Now the plan. Before a single stone is cut, before the first course is laid, the building is drawn on the ground at full scale. Imagine the building site in the early weeks of construction, the old church partly demolished or temporarily still standing, the ground cleared and levelled, and a team of men working with stakes driven into the earth and ropes stretched between them, laying out the full geometry of the building in lines across the ground, the crossing, the nave, the choir, the chapels radiating from the apse, the number 12 for the 12 apostles, the number 3 for the Trinity, the crossing of the nave and transepts forming the body of Christ in plan, laid out in the ground like a diagram of theology. These are not decorative choices layered onto a practical structure. The number symbolism and the structural logic are the same system. The theology is legible in the proportions.
And across 400 feet of that ground-level geometry, achieved with rope and stakes and geometric construction, and the trained eye of men who have done this before, who learned it from men who learned it before them, through a tradition of transmitted knowledge that has almost no written form, the margin of error is sometimes less than an inch.
How? How do you build to 200 feet without knowing the formula for stress? How do you know, looking at a wall rising into the air, whether it will stand or fall in the next hard winter? How do you teach the next man what you know when you can barely write it down, when the knowledge lives not in books but in hands, in eyes, in the specific angle at which a man holds his compass? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the questions that keep the history of this building from being a simple story of genius or faith or ambition. They are questions about how knowledge survives, about what a tradition is, about what is lost when a tradition breaks. He knows the answer to these questions only partially. He knows what works because he has seen it work. He knows what fails because he has seen it fail. Walls leaning, vaults cracking, towers settling in the clay. And those failures are part of his education too, written not in any book, but in the memory of the craft itself, passed from hand to hand, from eye to eye, across the cold mud of 100 building sites, in the quiet grammar of compass and line. You're probably lying down. The day is behind you. Whatever it held, whatever it asked of you, whatever it took, it's done now. You've set it down. And somewhere in the dark, or in the soft glow of a screen held close, you are horizontal, and the world has contracted to this. A pillow, a blanket, the sound of your own breathing, and a voice talking quietly about stone.
That is exactly where I hope to find you. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's precisely why I make these. There is no test at the end. There is nothing to remember. The dates don't matter tonight, and the names of the master builders. We'll meet them, but they won't be on any exam. You can let this wash over you the way the centuries washed over the building itself. Slowly, unhurriedly, stone by stone. I like to imagine this story unfolding across continents and time zones. Someone in Kyoto just before the light comes, someone in Edinburgh at the end of a long Tuesday, someone in Buenos Aires with the city still humming faintly outside the window. All of you lying down, all of you somewhere quiet, all of you carrying the weight of a day that is finally, mercifully, finished. This spinning rock has a great many people on it trying to sleep right now, and I find something genuinely comforting in that. If you know where you're listening from, leave it in the comments. I love reading them. Now, let me give you something to rest inside. Imagine a hill, not a dramatic hill, not a cliff, not a peak, just a slight rise above the flat of a French river valley, where the ground is firm enough to build on, where the river is close enough to float stone downstream, where the town has been growing for a generation, and the old church is too small, too low, too dark for what the bishop now has in mind. It is cold. It is almost always cold in the morning on a building site in northern France in the 12th century, and the cold comes up through the ground and through the thin soles of leather shoes and into the feet of every man who arrives at dawn to begin the work. The first tools have begun to sound. Not many, not yet. Just the preliminary work, the measuring, the marking, the clearing of ground. A mallet striking a stake into the earth, a rope pulled taut between 2 points and held there by a man on each end, while a third man checks the line with his eye, adjusts, checks again. The sound of that first mallet strike carries across the flat. The birds respond, then quiet again.
This is how it begins. The medieval night before that morning would have been profound, not dim, not dusky, profound, the way darkness is when there is no electric light anywhere in the world, when cloud cover means you cannot see your hand in front of your face, when the only light in the town comes from a candle in a window, a fire in a hearth, the dying embers in the lodge where the craftsmen sleep. The bells of Compline have rung, the last of the day's 8 canonical hours, the church's nightly instruction to the faithful. The day is over, commend yourself to God, go to sleep. And the town has quieted, the animals settled, the children down, the men in the lodge rolled into whatever they have for warmth, listening to the fire burn lower, thinking about tomorrow's work, the chalk lines laid out on the tracing floor showing the profiles of mouldings, the angles of arches, the dimensions that have to be cut into the stone before it can be lifted into place. Tomorrow, those lines become stone. Tonight, they are just chalk. The stars on a clear night above that hill would have been enormous. That is not a romantic exaggeration. Without the wash of artificial light that flattens our sky into grey, the medieval sky was a different object entirely, dense, dimensional, the Milky Way a visible presence, the stars close enough to feel like they meant something. The craftsmen sleeping in the lodge may not have been looking at them. They were tired, but the stars were there. They are always there. They were there before the first stone was laid, and they will be there long after the last one has fallen. The cathedral will take longer to build than any one person's life. That is the central fact of this story, and it is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. The master builder who drives the first stake into that hill will not live to see the vaults close. His apprentices, who are boys now, who are carrying water and sand and learning to dress stone with cold hands, may not live to see it. The building will outlast everyone who builds it. It will outlast everyone who worships in it during the first century of its life. It is being built, in some sense, for people who have not yet been born, for a future that no one on that site can fully picture, which means we have time. You don't need to hold anything tightly tonight. You don't need to remember the dates or the names or the geometry. You can let the stone be cut. You can let the walls begin to rise. You can let the centuries pass in the way that centuries pass when you are almost asleep, not quickly, not slowly, but the way deep things move, which is at their own pace and not yours. Somewhere in France, the first stones are arriving. Before a single wall rises, before the first course of stone is laid, before any architect's plan becomes anything more than lines scratched on parchment, the mountain must be opened. That is what a quarry is, an opening in the earth, a wound that becomes a gift.
For Chartres, there is a rare mercy in the geography. The quarry at Berchères-les-Pierres sits only 5 miles from the cathedral site, 5 miles, which in the logic of medieval construction is the difference between possible and miraculous. Other great churches of the age wait months for stone to travel overland from distant provinces, through fords and over rutted tracks that dissolve in the autumn rains. Chartres does not have that problem, not entirely. The stone is close enough that on a clear morning the men cutting at the quarry face can hear faintly the bells of the town they are building toward. That proximity is a gift that the builders would not have taken for granted. They would have known what it cost elsewhere to haul stone from further away.
But even 5 miles is not nothing, not when the stone weighs what stone weighs. The limestone of this region is why everything is possible. Limestone, dense enough to carry weight, workable enough to carve, resilient enough to last centuries. It is not granite, which resists the chisel like a closed argument. It is not sandstone, which crumbles under the patient pressure of water and ice. Limestone is a negotiation. It yields if you approach it correctly, if you understand its nature and respect its terms. And its most important secret is this: freshly quarried limestone is not yet what it will become. The craftsmen call it greenstone, not green in colour. It is pale, almost white, the colour of old chalk. but green in the way that timber is green when it is new cut and full of moisture. Freshly quarried limestone holds water in its pores, water that has been there for tens of thousands of years, trapped inside the sedimentary body of the rock since it was laid down at the bottom of a shallow sea. That moisture makes it soft, workable. A chisel moves through it almost willingly. An experienced carver can shape a capital, cut a moulding, dress a surface with far less effort than he will ever be able to apply once the stone has dried. Once it has cured and hardened in the open air, it becomes something close to permanent, dense, resistant, capable of carrying a vault for 800 years. The window is brief. The quarry master knows this. Time, with green stone, is always running. The quarry master is not a figure history has preserved by name for this particular site, but we know what he knew, because the knowledge is written in the walls. He could read stone the way a scholar reads a manuscript. He knew where the natural beds ran, the horizontal lines of weakness laid down by ancient geology, the planes along which the rock wanted to divide itself, if properly encouraged. He knew which sections were sound and which would fracture unpredictably, which faces would yield clean blocks and which would shatter into rubble. He walked the terraces of the chalk-white quarry, reading it like a language. His judgments were architectural before any architect arrived. The technique for splitting the block is ancient and extraordinarily effective. Holes are drilled along the intended fracture line. Wooden wedges are driven into the holes, hammered in with mallets, one after another, at intervals measured by the quarry master's eye rather than any instrument. And then water is poured over them. The wood absorbs the water. The wood swells. The pressure builds slowly, invisibly, in silence. And then the stone gives, with a crack that rolls across the terraces and echoes off the chalk walls, and the block separates along the line that was intended, following the geometry of its own hidden structure, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. The quarry fills with its own particular sounds, the rhythm of hammers on stone, regular, patient, slightly arrhythmic, like the sound of a large animal breathing, the crack and groan of splitting rock, sudden and sharp, and then immediately swallowed by silence. Men calling to each other across the chalk-white terraces, their voices flattened by the open sky, the words carrying less meaning than the sound itself. A check, an acknowledgement, a signal that the work continues and everyone is where they are supposed to be.
And then the problem of movement begins. A single column drum, the cylindrical section that stacks with others to build a nave column, weighs between 3 and 5 tons. A major keystone, the piece that locks a vault from above, weighs more. These are not figures that reward abstraction. 3 tons is a problem that lives in the body of every man and animal involved in moving it.
Sledges are built, rollers are laid in sequence, logs placed ahead of the sledge so that it rides forward over a moving platform, the rearmost roller constantly picked up and carried to the front by teams of men working alongside. Oxen are harnessed. The road from Berchères to Chartres is 5 miles of compacted earth, chalk rubble, mud in wet weather, dust in dry, and a gradient that seems negligible until you are responsible for keeping 3 tons of limestone moving across it without catastrophe. A single large block might take a week to make that journey, a week of coaxing, of adjusting, of men leaning their whole weight into ropes, of wheels sinking into soft ground and having to be levered out, of the entire operation stopping and restarting, the stone inching forward with the patience of something that does not experience urgency.
Where water access exists, along rivers, toward cathedral sites fortunate enough to sit beside navigable channels, the calculus changes. A barge can carry in a single load what 20 ox carts cannot manage in a week. The river becomes a highway, wide and smooth, indifferent to mud. Stone is rolled to the bank, lowered with ropes and timber cranes onto flat-bottomed boats, and carried downstream with a slowness that is nonetheless faster than anything the roads can offer. But it all begins in the quarry, with the opening of the earth, with the patient reading of the stone's hidden language, and the first hammer striking wood, and the water poured into the crack, and the waiting. The weight of what is coming is already here. It is sitting in the chalk-white terraces. It is waiting to move.
Stone arrives at the edge of the building site, still rough cut, still carrying the memory of the quarry in its ragged faces and chalky dust. And then it crosses a threshold, not a physical one, not a gate or a door, but a threshold of intention, because the stone that comes off the cart is raw material. What happens next, inside the long wooden building sitting in the shadow of the rising walls, is where raw material becomes architecture, the lodge, the loge, the loggia. Every cathedral site has one, always positioned close enough to the work that a carver can walk a finished capital to its scaffold position in under a minute. It is usually wood, long and low, sometimes 2 stories, always provisional looking compared to the permanence of what it serves. From the outside it is unimpressive, a workshop, a shed, but inside it is the most important building on the site.
Step through the door and the smell hits you first. Chalk dust and sawdust, stone powder drifting in the light from high windows, fresh plaster, damp and chalky sweet. Somewhere underneath all of it, the smell of men, of sweat, of bread, of candle tallow, of the particular warmth of bodies concentrated in close quarters through a long working day. It is loud in here, mallets against chisels, the scraping of stone on stone, the low, continuous percussion of a building site filtered through the walls and mixed with voices, with instruction, with the occasional sharp correction from someone who has spotted a mistake before it becomes permanent. Look at the floor, not the floor underfoot, though that too is remarkable, but the tracing floor, a flat expanse of white plaster, smooth and broad, sometimes covering the entire ground level of the building. This is where the master builder thinks out loud. He takes chalk and begins to draw, full scale, not sketches, not miniatures, not the small, careful drawings we now associate with architectural design, but lines drawn at the actual size of the thing being built. The curve of a window arch traced in chalk at its true radius, 8 feet across, 12 feet, the chalk marking the plaster in long sweeping strokes that take the whole arm. The profile of a moulding drawn actual size, every diminution, every quirk and ogee and fillet reproduced in chalk with a precision that has to be exact, because what is drawn on this floor is what will be cut from the stone. The tracing floor is not a representation of the cathedral, it is the cathedral in embryo, flat, white, drawn in impermanent lines that will be erased and redrawn as design evolves, as problems are discovered, as the logic of the building changes under the pressure of actually building it.
From the drawings come the templates. A template is a thin board, oak, sometimes poplar, cut to match exactly the profile drawn on the tracing floor. A carver takes it and presses it against his stone and marks the outline. The template is then passed to the next man, and to the next. Across the entire site, dozens of carvers might work from the same template, each one cutting the same profile into a different stone, so that when the stones are assembled, they will meet with perfect continuity. A single moulding running the full length of a nave arcade, 50 feet, 80 feet, may pass through 20 hands, 20 chisels, 20 separate blocks of stone, and emerge as something seamless, as if drawn by a single continuous gesture. The template makes this possible. The template is memory made physical, knowledge made transferable. It is the master builder's mind distributed across the labour of the whole site.
And that labour is divided with a precision that would surprise us now. The layers cut the rough blocks down to near final dimensions, heavy work, brutal on the shoulders, requiring endurance more than finesse. The setters place the cut stone into the wall, reading the geometry of each course, managing the lime mortar, ensuring the vertical joints stagger correctly so that no weakness runs from one course to the next. The carvers come last, working on capitals and voussoirs and mouldings that require a different kind of attention entirely, a slow, watchful attention, the chisel tapping rather than striking, the eye moving constantly between stone and template. The mortar makers work the kilns and mixing pits that never go cold, producing the lime paste that will hold all of it together for centuries.
And then there are the apprentices. Some of them are 12 years old.
They sweep the chalk dust. They carry water. They mix mortar under the supervision of men who correct them without ceremony. They watch. Above all, they watch. A boy in his first year in the lodge is not cutting stone. He is learning to see stone, learning how a master's hand moves, learning what a finished surface looks like compared to a surface that still needs work, learning the names of the tools, and then the names of the profiles, and then, slowly, the logic that connects them. He is being turned, through watching and carrying and sweeping and gradually attempting, into someone who knows something. The lodge is a school in which the curriculum is never written down.
This is where the guild mystery comes from. Not ceremony for its own sake, not ritual invented as self-importance, but the practical reality that what is known inside this building cannot easily be transmitted in words. The oaths of secrecy, the signs of recognition, the hierarchies of skill, these are the architecture of a knowledge system that lives in the hands. You cannot write down how to read the tracing floor. You cannot explain by letter how the template is held, how the chisel angle changes for different stone, what the sound of good cutting is versus careless cutting. You have to be here. You have to be present. Secrecy protects not information, but the irreplaceable thing that is knowledge embodied in persons. The wages come in coin, in bread, in candles, in lodging. A master carver earns more in a day than a mortar labourer earns in a week. An apprentice earns almost nothing. The hierarchy is absolute, and everyone inside it knows exactly where they stand.
But here's what matters. Inside this wooden building, this provisional structure that will be torn down before the cathedral it serves is ever finished, stone is being taught to become architecture. Raw material is being read and marked and reduced by patient violence to exact shapes, and those shapes will stand for 1,000 years. The lodge does not look like much from the outside. It was never meant to.
There is a building beneath the building. Before the first ashlar is laid, before the first course of dressed stone rises from the ground, before any of the geometry worked out on the tracing floor finds its way into the world, there is the other work, the invisible work, the work that will be buried the moment it is finished and never seen again, not by the builders, not by the priests who will pray in the nave, not by anyone. The foundation, the thing on which everything else depends and which no one will ever look at directly once the soil goes back. To understand what a medieval cathedral is, you have to understand what it is resting on. The master builder begins not with stone, but with earth. Before a single wall is conceived in final form, men are already in the ground, reading it. Stakes are driven into the soil at intervals, hard strikes, listening to the resistance. The ground is watched in rain, watched in drought, watched in the weeks after a wet season when the water table shifts. Sometimes clay amphoras are buried with their mouths open, left for days, then dug up and examined for moisture. The builders are interrogating the earth, asking it what it can bear, asking it where the water moves and where it pools, and where the subsoil gives way to something treacherous beneath. This is not superstition. This is geology performed by touch and instinct, and accumulated generations of watching things go wrong. Because things go wrong. In 1284, at Beauvais, in northern France, the choir vault collapsed. This was not a minor failure. This was the highest Gothic vault ever attempted, 157 feet from the floor to the point of the arch, a number that seemed to defy what stone could do, a number
that represented decades of ambition and calculation and the collective will of a city that wanted its cathedral to be the most impossibly vertical thing ever built by human hands. And then, one morning in November, it was not there anymore. The vault came down. The buttressing was insufficient, the foundations inadequate for lateral thrust of that magnitude. The geometry of aspiration had finally exceeded the geometry of what the ground would bear. What remained was rubble and a lesson that would be studied by builders for centuries. The earth has opinions, and eventually it expresses them.
This is what the foundation trench is. It is the moment when the builder submits to the earth's opinion before it is too late to matter. The trenches are dug by hand, mattock and shovel, basket and rope, the slow reduction of a field into a deep scar, sometimes 10 feet, sometimes 15, sometimes 20 or more, down through topsoil, down through fill and rubble from earlier structures, down through clay that sticks to boots and tools and skin, down until the mattock strikes something that does not give, bedrock or stable subsoil, something that will not compress, will not shift, will not decide in a generation or two that it was tired of holding. This is the depth you need. This is where you stop digging.
Stand in that trench for a moment. Let the scale of it reach you.
What does it feel like to dig the grave of a building before the building exists? To stand in a cut in the earth, 6 feet down, 8 feet down, and know that in 100 years there will be 200 feet of stone pressing on the place where your boots are standing, that the vault you will never see will be generating forces that will travel down through pier and stylobate and rubble core and lime and stone and into the very ground beneath your feet, into the ground you are standing on right now, before anything exists, while it is still just mud and intention. Do you feel it? The weight of the future pressing down from above while you are still only underground. This is what foundation work is. You are building the invisible base of something you will never see finished. You are the first hand. You are the part that is designed to disappear.
The foundation itself is not elegant. It is not dressed stone. It is rubble. Massive unworked pieces packed tight against each other in lime mortar, a mass wider than the wall it will carry, a spreading foot that distributes load across the maximum possible surface of bearing earth. The beauty of this is structural, not visual. Width is strength. The wider the foot, the thinner the pressure. The wall above will be precise, profiled, articulated into mouldings and courses that reflect centuries of accumulated aesthetic intelligence. The foundation does not care about any of that. The foundation cares only about not moving. But there is a problem. There is always a problem.
Water.
Lime mortar cures by a chemical reaction that requires air. Expose it to standing water during curing and the reaction is compromised. The mortar never fully sets, never reaches its designed strength, stays soft and susceptible at the very base of a structure that will spend centuries pressing down on it. And foundation trenches fill with water. They always fill with water. The deeper you go, the closer you get to the water table. And the water table is not a static thing. It rises and falls with the season. It floods what you have just dug in a single night of heavy rain. It undoes in hours the patient labor of days. So the builders pump. Archimedean screws turned by teams of men working in shifts, bucket chains moving water hand to hand from the trench to the surface, constant drainage through the wet season, the race between water coming in and mortar curing. This is work that leaves no trace in any building. No one carved the names of the men who spent 6 weeks standing in cold water, keeping a trench dry. No one wrote down how many bucket chains it took. But without that work, the mortar would be weak. And weak mortar at the foundation means everything above it is an argument with time that it will eventually lose. Before the first wall rises, the master builder walks the site. He is walking the plan. the cruciform laid out on the ground in stakes and string, the future nave, the future transepts, the future choir, the shape of a building that exists nowhere yet, except in the tracing floor drawings and in his head, and now, barely, in these marks in the dirt. He is walking the building before it is a building. He is learning its geometry with his feet. This is the humility of foundations. The first act of building is to go underground. The first knowledge is of what is beneath. Before you can reach for the sky, you have to understand the earth, and you have to be willing to disappear into it, to do your most important work in the dark, in the cold, in the wet, and then to watch it be buried and forgotten. The building will rise, the vault will soar, the glass will glow, and under all of it, packed in lime mortar, pressed deeper by every course of stone laid above, will be the work no one sees. Now the building begins to be visible, not visible in the way it will one day be visible, not the soaring nave, not the climbing buttresses, not the glass alive with morning light, visible in the way that a promise becomes visible, a line of dressed stone along the edge of a foundation trench, a course of ashlar cut square, laid level, its joints so thin you can barely slip a knife between them, a foot of height where there was nothing yesterday. This is the moment the building stops being a drawing on a tracing floor and becomes a thing in the world that pushes back against your hand when you press it. The masons call it ashlar. The word is almost as old as the practice. Dressed stone, precisely cut, laid in regular horizontal courses with mortar joints so fine and consistent that the wall reads as a single surface, not a collection of pieces. Run your eye along a Gothic wall, and what you see is the signature of quality, uniform courses, clean lines, no wandering joints, no irregular faces, no evidence of struggle. What you don't see is the hours of dressing that produced each block, the mason at his banker, his stone-cutting bench, chiseling the face flat, truing the edges, checking the bed with a straight edge, cutting again. Every block presented to the wall must already be right before the mortar goes down, because mortar is not a corrective. It is a sealer, a binder, a glue between surfaces already true. The mortar itself is a technology as old as Rome and older. Quicklime, burned from limestone in great kilns nearby, slaked with water in a process that throws off heat and steam in quantities that feel almost violent, mixed with sand in careful proportion. Sometimes hair is worked in, animal hair, coarse fibres, as a binder, the way a plasterer uses it still. The mix must be right. Too much water and it runs. Too little and it won't seat. The journeyman mortar maker has done this so many times he reads it by texture, by the way it falls from a trowel. He knows before he measures. And then a thing that every person who has ever done construction work has known, and that most people walking past the finished building have never considered: the mortar doesn't dry. Drying is the wrong word entirely. What happens in that thin joint between two stones is chemistry, slow and patient, completely indifferent to whether the building schedule is convenient. The lime reacts with carbon dioxide in the air. It carbonates. It transforms gradually over months and years from a paste into something closer to stone itself. A wall built today is not as strong as that wall will be in a decade. The building is still becoming itself long after the scaffolding comes down. This is time working differently than we're accustomed to thinking about it. Not our time. The building's time. The wall itself is not what it appears. Press your hand against the outer face of a Gothic cathedral, and you are touching one face of a structure that has another face some distance behind it, with rubble and mortar packed in the cavity between. An outer face, an inner face, a core of broken stone and lime that bears compression as well as solid ashlar and costs a fraction as much to produce. The master builder is not building a solid wall. He is building two thin walls that hold each other together across a common filling, weight saved, material saved, height made possible that solid construction would deny him. The Gothic wall is honest about being a structure. It does not pretend to be a mountain. The scaffolding climbs with the work, wooden poles, rough cut, lashed with rope at every joint, no metal connectors, nothing standardized, nothing interchangeable. Each scaffold is essentially handmade for the particular geometry of the wall section it serves. Wattle platforms woven across horizontal members to give the masons a surface to stand on and to stage their materials. And projecting through the wall face at regular intervals, horizontal pole ends seated in holes left deliberately in the masonry, putlock holes, each one the width of a scaffold pole, each one a point where the scaffold anchored itself to the rising wall rather than standing free. They are still there. Walk along the nave of almost any Gothic church, look at the exterior face above the floor line, and you will find them. Rows of small square holes, regularly spaced, ascending the wall in bands. The building still carries the record of how it was built. The scaffold is gone. The holes remain. A good day's work, one course of ashlar raised across a section of wall, perhaps 12 inches of height, perhaps less. The mortar must cure adequately before the next course loads it. The pace is not slow because the workers are slow. The pace is slow because the materials require it. Push faster, and you crack the joints below with the weight above. The building teaches patience to anyone who tries to rush it. And then winter comes, and the building sleeps.
Fresh mortar and frost are enemies. Ice expanding inside an uncured joint breaks the bond, forces the faces apart, undoes in one night what took a week to lay. So when the temperature falls, the builders stop. They pack straw over the completed courses, they bank the exposed beds, they walk away and do not come back until spring. The building sits in cold silence for months, still becoming itself in the chemistry of those thin joints, still carbonating, still gaining strength in the dark.
The walls rise in spring, pause in winter, rise again in spring, like breathing, like the seasons themselves.
This is how a cathedral is built, not in a single sustained effort of human will pressing toward completion, in pulses, in the rhythm of what the climate allows and what the mortar demands. Year by year, course by course, the wall climbs a foot, 2 feet, 10 feet, and the geometry that existed only in stakes and string and the master builder's memory begins to declare itself against the sky. A shape emerges, not finished, not close to finished, but real now in a way that cannot be undone. The argument with time has begun. There is a cathedral you cannot see. It was built before the stone cathedral. It was built around the stone cathedral while the stone cathedral was being built. It was built again above the stone cathedral after the walls were finally closed. And when the stone cathedral was finished, when the last course was laid and the last pinnacle was dressed, the other cathedral, the wooden one, was taken down piece by piece and carried away, or burned, or rotted slowly into the ground. It left almost nothing behind. It left only the building it had made possible. This is the cathedral of wood, and it is the one the histories forget. Consider how a stone arch stands. An arch is a compression structure. Each wedge-shaped stone, each voussoir, transfers its weight outward and downward through its neighbours, and the whole arrangement holds because the forces are in balance, because the geometry resolves into itself. But an arch only works when it is complete. A half-built arch is not a weakened arch. A half-built arch is not an arch at all. It is falling. The stones have nowhere to transfer their load. They are simply mass held temporarily by human hands, by rope, by wood, waiting for the keystone that will lock the whole system into its permanent resolution.
So, before a single stone of an arch can be placed, a carpenter must build the arch first, in wood. A temporary form curved to the precise profile the mason has designed, built from cut timber and shaped boards, sitting on posts and wedges, occupying exactly the space the finished arch will occupy, the centering. And on this wooden ghost of the arch that does not yet exist, the mason lays his voussoirs one by one, inching toward the crown until the keystone drops into place and the mortar begins its slow cure.
And then the carpenter returns, the moment called striking. The centering is one of the tensest in all of construction. The wedges are knocked out, the posts are pulled away, the wooden form drops piece by piece, and for the first time the arch stands on nothing but itself and the logic of its own geometry. For the first time, it is asked to be what it was designed to be. Either it stands or it does not. There is no middle outcome. Picture the silence in that moment, the masons standing back, the master builder watching from a distance that is honest about his uncertainty. All that labour, all that stone, all that precision, now tested against a question that only the arch itself can answer. Will it hold? Is the curve correct? Is the mortar cured enough? Did the centering settle slightly while the stones were being laid? And did that settlement introduce a misalignment too small to see and large enough to matter? The arch either stands or it teaches everyone present what went wrong.
For every arch in a cathedral, and there are hundreds, in the nave, in the aisles, under every window, supporting every vault, this drama played out. For the great vaulted bays overhead, the centering was not a simple form but a vast wooden scaffold filling the space below, rising from the floor, carrying curved ribs of timber to cradle the stone ribs as they were assembled. Hundreds of trees for a single bay, erected, loaded with stone, left while the mortar hardened, then struck, then dismantled and moved to the next bay, then erected again.
The wood was always there. The wood was always temporary. And when the stone was done, the wood disappeared, and what remained looked as though it had arrived whole, as though no scaffold had ever touched it. But here is where the wood did not disappear. Above the vaulted ceiling, invisible from below, above the stone that visitors look up and marvel at, there is a space between the vault and the roof. And in that space, the carpenters built something permanent, something that would stay, a forest.
This is not a metaphor. The French craftsman called it exactly that, la forêt, the forest, because that is what it looks like. An enormous tangle of oak beams, of curved principals and straight collars, of diagonal braces and vertical posts, dense and dark and bewildering in its complexity, stretching the entire length of the building above the stone you never see. Every major medieval cathedral in Europe has one. Notre Dame de Paris had one, a forest of roughly 1,300 oak trees, each of those trees more than 300 years old at the time they were felled, which means those trees were saplings when the Normans crossed into England, were already ancient when the first stone of the cathedral was laid, were growing in French soil while the plans were still ideas in a master builder's mind.
Those trees burned in 2019.
In an afternoon, a millennium of wood was gone. The carpenters who built that forest were not masons. They were a separate guild with separate knowledge, separate tools, separate apprenticeships, separate pride. They worked in a different material with different rules. Stone wants to be compressed. Wood wants to be bent, to carry loads in tension and bending, to flex slightly and return. A master carpenter knew his wood the way a master mason knew his stone, knew which grain orientation would carry a load and which would split, knew how green timber moved as it dried, knew how to cut a scarf joint that would hold for centuries without metal fasteners. And then there is the question of how the stone got up there at all.
A treadwheel crane, a great wooden wheel 8 feet across, sometimes 12, mounted on an axle with a drum and a rope. A man walking inside it, like a creature inside a wheel, his weight turning the drum winding the rope lifting a load of stone that no team of men could carry. There were gin poles, there were windlasses, there were pulleys arranged in series to multiply mechanical advantage. The physics of lifting were understood in practice, if not in the language of physics. A man in a wheel could raise hundreds of pounds of dressed stone to a height of 100 feet, one slow revolution at a time.
All of it wooden,
all of it gone.
This is the thread of melancholy that runs through the whole wooden history of a cathedral. The scaffold is always erased, not just metaphorically, literally. The holes in the wall where the putlog beams sat, those remain, those you can see, but the beams themselves are gone. The centering that held every arch through its moment of vulnerability, gone. The cranes that lifted every stone to its final position, dismantled when the building was done, their timber too valuable to leave, their job complete. Wood is the skeleton the stone is built around. When the stone can stand alone, the wood steps away.
And the stone stands there in silence, looking as though it required no help from anything, looking as though it arrived complete, as though it always knew what it was. The scaffold is always erased. That is the final illusion a cathedral performs, and
now, finally, the people.
Not the arch, not the stone, not the geometry. The people who were cold in the morning and tired by midday and went home to something, a wife, a fire, a bowl of something thin, and came back the next day and did it again, for years, for decades, some of them for their entire working lives, on a building they knew they would never see finished.
We know their names, some of them. The Exeter Cathedral fabric rolls, running from 1279 to 1326, are among the most complete surviving wage accounts in medieval England. Not poetry, not chronicle. Accounts, columns of names and days worked and pennies paid, dry as dust and startling as a face in a crowd. A man named William the Quarryman, a man called John le Mason, a woman, her name lost, her function recorded, paid for carrying water to the lime pit. They are there, in the ink, which means they were here, in the world, breathing and working and needing to be paid.
The hierarchy of wages tells you everything about the hierarchy of the site. A master mason, the man who held the design in his head, who translated the geometry into instruction, who alone knew where every stone was going, might earn 12 pence a day. 12. That was the pinnacle. A skilled carver, a man who could cut a capital or work foliage into stone, earned 6 to 8 pence. A setter, fitting dressed stone into courses, 4 to 5. And at the bottom, the men and women doing the work that broke the body and left no visible mark on the wall, 1 to 2 pence. For a full day, in the cold, with quicklime in the air that could blind you if the wind shifted wrong.
Women carried water, women mixed mortar, women hauled rubble from where stone was cut to where it was needed. They are in the accounts, paid less than men doing the same work, not hidden, not erased, recorded, matter-of-factly, as though the discrepancy required no explanation. It apparently required none. The accounts do not blink, neither apparently did anyone else. Children appear too, given pennies, literal pennies, 1, sometimes 2, for running errands, carrying messages, fetching tools. Some of them were 10 years old, some younger, and the ones with aptitude, the ones who showed the particular quality of attention that a master mason recognized, were sometimes apprenticed, taken on, given a future in stone. Those children might spend the next 40 years of their life on cathedral sites, might die on them.
Because people died. The scaffold is always erased, yes, but the bodies were not, falling from heights, crushed when a load of stone shifted on its rope, burned, chemically burned severely, permanently, by quicklime, which is not merely an irritant but a substance that reacts with the moisture of your skin, and generates heat enough to destroy tissue, to take a hand, to take an eye. There was no liability, there was no compensation, there was no tribunal to determine fault, and no fund to support a widow. What there was, and this is not nothing, was the cathedral parish offering masses for workers killed on site, prayers said for the soul of the man who fell. This was understood at the time as meaningful protection, not cynically, not as a substitute offered in bad faith, as actual insurance of the only kind that ultimately mattered, the soul's passage. Whether we find that sufficient is beside the point. They found it sufficient, or they found it the only thing available, which is sometimes the same thing.
The myth of voluntary labour, the devout peasant giving freely to raise God's house, is partly true and partly something else. Some gave. Indulgences were offered for those who worked without pay, and some came freely and quarried and hauled and sweated because they believed it counted towards something beyond the weekly wage. But the building rolls also record coerced labour, labour levied on local populations as a feudal obligation, labour extracted from the poor who had no choice in the matter. Both things are true. The faith and the compulsion coexisted. They usually do. There were sometimes strangers on the site, French masons brought over for their knowledge of the new Gothic techniques, the flying buttress, the particular logic of the pointed arch in its French elaborations, the tricks of window tracery that English craftsmen were still learning. They came over the channel carrying knowledge in their hands. They were expensive and sometimes resented and occasionally brilliant. The English masons watched them and learned and improved, and within 2 generations, English Gothic had surpassed its teachers. The transfer was complete. The teachers went home.
And through all of it, the town watched. This is the thing the wage records cannot capture, the community identity that accreted around the building in progress, the way a cathedral became the largest thing in a person's world, not metaphorically, literally, the tallest structure they had ever seen or would ever see, became a source of pride so intense it bent towards something close to ownership. This is our tower, our window, our city, made visible in stone and rising above everything flat and ordinary around it. What did they think they were doing? The man walking inside the treadwheel, the woman lifting a pail of water, the boy carrying a message from one end of the site to the other. Did they feel God in the work, in the ache of it, in the cold morning and the weight and the slow rising of the walls? Did they ever stand back and look up and feel afraid of what their own hands had helped to make? Did they wonder if it was worth it? The winters, the lime burns, the falls, the wages that barely covered the bread. Did the beauty of it ever cut through the exhaustion and land somewhere true? We do not know. The accounts record days and pence. They do not record what a man thought when the last scaffold came down, when the nave stood revealed for the first time in its full height, when the light came through the new glass and fell across the floor in colours that had never existed indoors before. But they were there. They were cold and tired and present. The stone stands because their hands put it there. There is one part of the cathedral building story that almost never gets told, not the masons, not the architects, not the bishops or the benefactors, not the men on the scaffolding or the boys driving the oxen, a different figure entirely, one who left almost no trace in the wage rolls, who appears only obliquely in the building accounts, mentioned in passing, easy to skip over. The master carpenter, not the carpenter who made the choir stalls, not the wood carver working the misericords, the engineer, the man responsible for the thing that made everything else possible and that then, deliberately, completely, disappeared. The wooden skeleton. Here is the problem no one talks about when they talk about medieval stone construction. Stone cannot support itself while it is being built. An arch, once complete, is among the strongest structural forms ever devised. It directs force outward and downward along its own curve. It can stand for 1,000 years. It requires no maintenance. It barely needs to be thought about. But an arch mid-construction is catastrophically unstable. It is a collection of heavy wedge-shaped stones, each of which will fall inward the moment you let go of it, until the keystone drops into place and locks the whole system into compression. Until that moment, every stone in an arch wants to fall. Gravity is patient and constant and entirely indifferent to the ambitions of the bishop.
So the carpenters built a second cathedral first. This is the thing worth sitting with. Before the stone nave could rise, Before the great choir vault could be assembled, the carpenters had to construct an entire wooden framework called centering, or sometimes false work, that temporarily held the shape of every arch and vault and rib, while the masons built around it and through it and over it. The stone followed the wood gave the stone its form, and when the mortar had cured, when the keystone was driven home with a mallet and the arch had locked itself into permanent compression, the centering was struck, removed, lowered to the ground. The wood that had held everything was taken away, and the stone stood alone, holding itself as it had always been intended to. The wooden cathedral vanished so the stone one could exist.
We know almost nothing about most of these men, the master carpenters. Their names surface occasionally: William of Hurley at Ely, Richard of Stowe, a handful of others. But their work, by definition, left no physical trace. You cannot excavate what was deliberately dismantled. You cannot study what was reused as scaffold boards, as firewood, as floor planks in the lodge. The wood was too valuable to leave. It was stripped and repurposed the moment it had done what it needed to do. What we can work out from later records and surviving examples of centering elsewhere is the sheer complexity involved. The wooden forms had to be precise in the mathematical sense, not the approximate sense. A pointed arch has a geometry. A compound ribbed vault of the English Gothic style has an extremely complicated geometry, multiple curves intersecting at calculated angles, ribs that spring from different points and have to meet, exactly, at the crown. The master carpenter had to translate the master mason's design from parchment to full-scale wooden reality, had to build something that would hold tons of stone above the heads of the workers below, had to do this repeatedly across the entire length of the nave, and had to ensure that when the centering came down, the vault would not move.
Not shift, not settle slightly, not crack along the crown where the keystones met, not move.
The margin for error was the difference between a vault standing for 800 years and a vault lying on the floor in rubble, and the carpenters could not test their work. There was no partial version, no proof of concept. The centering went up, the stone went on, the mortar cured, the centering came down, and you discovered immediately and finally whether the calculation had been correct. They got it right, repeatedly. Across decades of construction, across changing seasons and changing masters, the vaults of Lincoln and Salisbury and Canterbury and Ely stand precisely because the wooden forms that assembled them were precisely made by men whose names we mostly cannot recover. The carpenters who built the thing that disappeared so the visible thing could stand. There is a bitter irony in it, or maybe not an irony at all. Maybe this is simply what most labour looks like, the preparation that enables the result, the scaffolding that comes down when the work is done. The beautiful vault gets the visitors. The wooden form that made it possible gets the firewood pile. William of Hurley's great lantern at Ely, the octagonal timber vault above the crossing tower, one of the most breathtaking spaces in English medieval architecture, wood rather than stone, because the span was too wide for masonry to safely bridge, survives. You can stand under it. You can look up at it. The centering that assembled it is gone. The vault remains, and it is extraordinary, and every wooden element in it was shaped by hand with tools that would not look unfamiliar to a carpenter today. But for every William of Hurley, there were 100 unnamed men crouching in the half-dark between scaffold and vault, fitting wooden ribs to wooden frames, checking curves against drawings scratched on boards with charcoal, building the shape of something beautiful and temporary so that something beautiful and permanent could follow after. The stone stands because the wood held it while it learned to stand alone. The glass came last, or nearly last, but it was never an afterthought.
This is where most accounts of cathedral construction turn toward the aesthetic, toward colour, toward light, toward the theological symbolism of illumination pouring through red and blue and gold into the nave below. And all of that is true and worth saying. but it misses something technical, something structural that the glaziers understood with a precision that is easy to overlook when you are standing in the nave with your head tilted back, watching the light move.
The windows of a Gothic cathedral are not decoration inserted into a wall. They are the wall.
Consider what the Gothic structural revolution actually accomplished. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress. These three technologies working in concert solved a single engineering problem that had constrained Romanesque builders for 3 centuries. The problem was load. Stone vaults are enormously heavy, and their weight pushes not only downward but outward, a lateral thrust that tends to push the walls apart and bring the whole thing down. Romanesque builders solved this by making the walls massively thick, by keeping the windows small, by essentially using the wall itself as a counterweight. It worked. It worked for centuries, but it produced buildings that were dark, that were heavy, that felt more like caves than like skies. The Gothic solution was to redirect the thrust, take it off the wall entirely, carry it outside via the flying buttress arcs to the freestanding piers beyond the building envelope, where it can be absorbed without threatening the interior structure. If the wall no longer needs to carry the vault's lateral thrust, the wall no longer needs to be massive. And if the wall no longer needs to be massive, the wall can be almost entirely removed. What remains is a skeleton, piers, shafts, ribs, and between the bones of the skeleton, you fill the openings with glass.
This is the logic that produced Chartres, that produced Sainte-Chapelle, where the walls are so thoroughly replaced by window that the stone tracery between the panels seems almost vestigial, almost an excuse for the glass to hang in. The glaziers inherited a structural fact and made it transcendent, but they were also, and this is what gets lost, operating within engineering constraints as tight as any the masons faced.
The leading that holds the glass panels together, the network of H-shaped lead strips called cames, is not strong. It is malleable, which is why it works. It can be cut and bent and shaped to follow any curve the design requires, any profile, any figure, but it offers almost no resistance to wind pressure. A large window panel held only by its leading is a panel that will flex in a strong gust and eventually crack. Every glazier working on a major commission knew this. Their solution was the iron armature. Saddle bars, horizontal iron rods set into the stone at intervals across the window opening, against which the glass panels were tied with copper or lead wire. The saddle bars held the panels against the wind, kept them flat, distributed pressure across the iron rather than concentrating it in the leading. Installing them correctly required coordination between the glazier and the mason. The bar holes had to be cut into the stone at precisely the right depth and spacing before the glass went in, which meant the glazier's panel dimensions had to be communicated to the mason's workshop, sometimes years before the glass itself was completed.
The windows of a major cathedral were often made off-site. This is the detail that consistently surprises people. The glaziers did not work on a scaffold high in the clerestory, cutting and painting and leading glass in the wind and cold. They worked at ground level in a workshop on a large flat table called a tracing board. The design was drawn full scale on the board with chalk or lead point. The glass was cut to shape on the board, held up against the design, checked. The painted details, the faces, the drapery folds, the inscriptions, were applied with a vitreous paint called grisaille, a mixture of ground glass, iron oxide, and a binding agent, applied with a brush and then fired in a kiln to fuse permanently to the glass surface. Colour came from the glass itself, from metallic oxides added to the molten batch, copper for green, cobalt for blue, manganese for purple, gold, actual gold, dissolved in acid, for the ruby red that glows like no other colour in the nave when the afternoon sun comes through the west window. Then the completed panels were transported to site, carried up the scaffold, fitted into their iron armature and wired in. The moment the panel was set into the window opening and the centering light fell through it for the first time into the interior space, you could not adjust the composition. You could not correct a face that read wrong at distance. You could not shift a figure that unbalanced the overall design. Whatever judgment calls the glazier had made at the tracing board, 40 feet below, now committed permanently to light and stone. This is why the great glaziers developed what amounts to a visual language specifically engineered for distance, figures outlined in heavy dark leading that reads as drawing from the floor, faces simplified, features bold, the subtleties of expression traded for legibility. The blue and red panels of Chartres that look almost abstract up close, almost crude in their simplicity, resolve at nave level into something that feels like music made visible.
There is a story, probably not literally true, but accurate in the way that useful stories often are, that when the glaziers completed the south rows at Chartres, a bishop looked up at it and wept, not for the theology, not for the symbolism of the apocalypse rendered in coloured glass. He wept because it was beautiful in a way that seemed to have no possible human explanation for how it had gotten there, high above the nave, glowing like a second sun. The glazier who designed it knew exactly how it had gotten there. He had stood at a tracing board, measuring, calculating, converting a 12-foot circle into a grid of lead and glass that would hold its shape against 8 centuries of wind. The bishop saw a miracle. The glazier had made a building system. Both were right. There is a figure in the construction of a medieval cathedral who appears in almost no popular account of the process, not the master builder, not the bishop who commissioned the work, not the glazier, not the sculptor, not the anonymous stonecutters whose marks you can still find if you know where to look on the dressed faces of the piers. This figure is the quarry master, and without him, none of it happens. Not one stone is laid. Consider what the cathedral actually is at its most basic material level. It is a mountain that has been disassembled, transported, and reassembled in a different shape. The limestone of Chartres Cathedral came primarily from quarries at Berchères-les-Pierres, roughly 8 miles to the southeast. 8 miles. For stone that arrives by the ton, by the thousands of tons, moving on wooden carts pulled by oxen over roads that were not engineered for this kind of load, 8 miles might as well be a continent. The logistical operation required to keep a major cathedral site continuously supplied with cut stone was, in terms of its complexity and coordination, comparable to supplying an army in the field, except that the campaign lasted not months but generations. The quarrymaster had to understand stone in a way that no modern engineer is trained to understand it, not just its compressive strength, not just its workability under the chisel. He had to understand its bed. Limestone is laid down in horizontal beds deposited in ancient shallow seas over millions of years of sediment accumulation, and the orientation of those beds relative to the load they will carry in the finished structure matters enormously. Stone laid in its natural bed, that is, with the bedding planes running horizontal, oriented as they were in the earth, performs entirely differently under load than stone turned on its face. Use it correctly, and the compressive load settles into it the way weight settles into a stack of paper. Use it incorrectly, and the stone will spall, will delaminate, will shear apart along its planes in ways that no amount of skill in the cutting or the laying can prevent. The quarry master selected stone not just by quality, but by orientation. He marked each block as it left the quarry, indicating how it should be placed. His knowledge was not written down. It was carried. But here's the detail that changes how you see the entire enterprise. The quarry did not simply supply stone on demand. The quarry master and the master builder worked in a relationship that was more like collaboration between two specialists than supplier and client. Before a new campaign of work began, before the foundations were dug, before the first course of ashlar was bedded in mortar, the master builder went to the quarry. He looked at the face being worked. He assessed what the stone could give him, and then he designed accordingly.
This is the reversal that rarely gets explained. We tend to imagine the great cathedrals as having been conceived complete in the mind of a visionary architect, then executed in the world's resistant matter. The stone was merely the medium. The vision came first, but the actual process ran in both directions simultaneously. What the quarry could produce constrained and shaped what the master builder could design. The size of available stone determined the module of the masonry. The local stone's capacity to be carved in fine detail determined the intricacy of the mouldings. At some sites, the local limestone was too soft for the crisp profiles the master builder wanted for his column capitals. The solution was not to redesign the capitals, but to source a second stone, a harder, finer-grained limestone from a more distant quarry, specifically for the carved elements, while using the local stone for the structural mass where its softness did not matter. Cathedrals built in regions with poor local stone sometimes show this dual material strategy clearly if you know to look for it. The structural core in one color, the carved details in another.
And then there is the question of time.
The quarry master had to think forward in a way that almost nothing in modern construction requires. Freshly quarried limestone contains what is called quarry sap, moisture held in the pores of the stone from its long burial in the earth. Stone worked and placed while it still contains quarry sap is easier to cut, more tractable under the chisel, more forgiving of minor errors in dressing. But it is also weaker. The strength of the finished structure depended on the stone being allowed to dry out, to cure, to harden after exposure to air. This process takes months, sometimes longer, which meant the quarry master had to extract and rough-cut stone not for the work happening now, but for the work that would happen in the next season, or the season after that. He was perpetually working ahead of the site, perpetually cutting stone for a future his master builder had sketched on parchment but not yet built.
The stones sitting in the quarry yard, drying, hardening through the winter, those stones had already been measured. They were already committed to a specific location in a structure that did not yet exist. The numbers scratched into them in the quarry corresponded to numbers in the master builder's drawings. A block cut at Chartres in November would become a specific voussoir in a specific arch at Chartres the following spring. The system required both men to carry a model of the unbuilt cathedral simultaneously in their heads, and to trust that the other man was carrying the same model.
When the block finally arrived on site and was lifted into position and fitted against its neighbours without shimming, without adjustment, without the need for recutting, that was not luck. That was two men, 8 miles apart, working in the same mental space. The cathedral as a shared hallucination, made permanent in stone.
There is another layer to this story that almost never gets told. We talk about the master builder, we talk about the quarry master, we reconstruct the logistics of timber and stone, the financing of campaigns, the geometry of the flying buttress, and all of that is real, all of that matters.
But cathedrals were not built by two men with a shared hallucination. They were built by bodies.
Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands, across the decades of a single building campaign. Men who left almost no record, no names in the documents, no drawings attributed to them, no tombs inside the building they spent their working lives constructing. The master builder might be remembered, his name scratched into a labyrinth on the nave floor, as at Chartres, as at Reims, where the masters are named in stone. But the men who actually placed the stone, who mixed the mortar, who climbed the scaffolding at dawn, they are ghosts, almost entirely.
Almost.
Because they left something behind that the documents never mention and that art historians spent centuries not thinking to look for. They left marks, cut into the face of nearly every ashlar block in every major Gothic cathedral. If you know where to look and if the light is at the right angle, you will find small symbols, geometric shapes mostly, a circle with a cross inside it, a capital V with a line through the stem, a simple chevron, an asterisk, a shape that looks almost like the letter R but isn't quite, consistent, repeated, each mark appearing dozens or hundreds of times across the surface of the wall, always in the same form, never varying. These are called banker marks or mason's marks. The terminology shifts depending on who you ask and which country you're studying. And here is what they mean. Each working mason, each man at the bench, the banker, they called it, the stone-cutting bench, had his own personal symbol, assigned or chosen at the beginning of his working life, possibly inherited from a father who worked the same trade, possibly given to him by the lodge on his first day. The mark was his signature in the most literal possible sense. Before a finished block left his bench and went into the wall, he cut his mark into it. A single blow of the chisel usually, sometimes 2 or 3 strokes, shallow, clean, unmistakable. Why? For pay. The foreman, or the master builder's clerk, or whoever kept the site accounts, and someone always kept accounts, even at the most chaotic medieval building campaigns, because money does not organize itself. That man walked the wall at intervals and counted marks. He counted how many blocks each man had dressed that week, that fortnight, that season. The mark transformed the anonymous block into a unit of individual labor. The block said, "This man made me. Pay him accordingly." Piecework, in the 13th century, on the walls of a building meant to last until the end of time. Think about that for a moment. The cathedral was not just a spiritual undertaking, it was also a payroll, a system of individual accounting embedded permanently in the fabric of the building. The financial records that actually tracked those payments are gone. Almost none survive. But the marks themselves survive. The marks are the receipts. The marks are what remains after the money changed hands, and the ledgers rotted, and the clerk who wrote the numbers died and was forgotten. When a mason placed his marked block in the wall, the mark would sometimes face inward toward the interior of the building, sometimes outward. Sometimes it was placed where no one would ever see it again once the neighboring course was laid. The mark was not decorative. It was not intended to be seen by worshippers or bishops or the building's patrons. It was a message directed at the accounting system, not at posterity. And yet, there is something extraordinary in what it accidentally became.
Walk into Chartres Cathedral, stand in the nave and look at the base of the columns, at the lower courses of the wall where the light comes at a low angle in the afternoon. Run your fingers along the face of the stone if the attendants are not watching too closely. You will feel them before you see them. Small cuts, shallow channels, the ghost of a chisel strike made by a man who was born around 1180 and died around 1250, and whose name we will never know.
He is still there, not metaphorically, not spiritually, in the sense that cathedral guides mean when they say that. Literally, the mark he cut with his own hand is in the stone. The geometry of his personal symbol, whatever he chose or was assigned, is pressed into the limestone of a building that has stood for 800 years and will stand, if nothing catastrophic intervenes, for 800 more. The masters built the building. The vision came from the master builder's head. The financing came from the bishop's appeals, the pilgrimage revenue, the aristocratic gifts. But the building exists because of hundreds of men with banker marks, men who were cold in winter and probably coughing from stone dust, men who developed the particular muscular economy of someone who has swung a hammer in the same motion 10,000 times. Men whose bodies were shaped by this work, whose joints and backs and hands were permanently altered by it. Some of them worked their whole lives on a single cathedral and never saw it finished. The building campaigns ran for generations. A man could apprentice to the lodge as a boy, work until his hands gave out, and die before the nave was vaulted. His son might work the same site. His grandson might be the one who was there when the last stone was placed. 3 generations of the same family, the same mark appearing across 3 different campaigns, 3 different levels of the wall, if you could trace it, which occasionally, very occasionally, you can. The mark did not change. The mark was inherited.
Which means the mark is not just a payroll receipt.
It is a family name, written in stone, in a building that does not contain their graves, does not record their deaths, does not remember their faces,
but remembers permanently that they were there.
There is something else in those walls that almost no one talks about. Not the marks. Something older than the marks. Something that was happening before the first stone was ever quarried, before the master builder drew his first line in the dust, before the bishop held his first fundraising appeal for a building that would not be finished in his lifetime or his successors. It was happening in the forest.
The roof of a Gothic cathedral, the part you never see, the part sealed above the stone vaulting, invisible from below and inaccessible from above, without a ladder and a guide and a certain willingness to crouch, is made of wood. Enormous quantities of wood, carefully selected, seasoned, shaped into an intricate system of timber, framing so dense and complex that when archaeologists first documented the roof structure of Notre Dame de Paris in the early 20th century, they called it the forest, not metaphorically. That was the technical name, la forêt, because that is what it resembles, a canopy of interlocking trunks, angled and braced and pegged, forming the skeleton that holds the lead roof above the stone. A forest reconstructed inside a cathedral, a forest that was, in most cases, assembled from a single forest.
Here is what that required. A Gothic cathedral nave might need 2,000 oak trees for its roof structure. Some estimates for the largest cathedrals run higher, 2,000 mature oaks, not saplings, trees with trunks wide enough that a man cannot wrap his arms around them, trees that had been growing, in many cases, for 150 years or more before they were felled, trees that were, when the cathedral builders came for them, already older than the cathedral would eventually be when it was finished. Someone had to find them. Someone had to negotiate for them. Someone had to organize the felling, which required large teams working in rotation. The trees had to be limbed and dragged. There were no wheeled vehicles capable of moving a mature oak trunk through a medieval forest, so the dragging was done with oxen and chains and an enormous amount of effort along paths cut specifically for the purpose, paths that existed briefly and were then swallowed back by the forest. The timber had to be moved to water, loaded onto rafts or barges, floated down river systems to the construction site, unloaded, stored in covered sheds to continue drying, and eventually shaped by carpenters whose title in French was charpentier, from the Latin carpentarius, a word that originally meant a maker of wheeled vehicles, not a builder, which tells you something about the mobility required by the trade before it became associated with fixed structures. This took years. The timber procurement for a major cathedral campaign could begin a decade before the first stone was laid. You were not building a building. You were managing a supply chain that extended back into forests 60 or 70 miles away, administered by men who would die before the building was enclosed, whose contribution would be sealed above the vaulting and forgotten.
But here's where it becomes something more than logistics.
The carpenters who shaped those timbers, who cut the mortise and tenon joints that locked the roof frame together, who raised the enormous principal rafters into position with systems of ropes and pulleys and leverage we can only partially reconstruct, those carpenters also left marks, not banker marks in the mason's sense. Something different, something that was functional and then became accidental testimony. They numbered their joints. A complex timber roof frame is assembled on the ground first, in sections, to confirm that the joints fit and the angles are correct. Then it is disassembled and raised into position piece by piece. To reassemble it correctly in the air, at height, under difficult conditions, without being able to stop and puzzle over which tenon fits which mortise, the carpenters marked each joint with Roman numerals cut directly into the wood. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3 strokes, a complex arrangement of cuts that told the team aloft exactly which piece connected to which, in which orientation, at which angle. Those marks are still there, in the surviving medieval roof structures of England and France, and there are more than people realize because the wood sealed above a stone vault is protected from fire and weather alike. The assembly numbers are still legible, cut with a chisel or scribed with a marking gauge into oak that has darkened to near black over 7 centuries. The numbers tell you the sequence. They tell you how the frame was organized into bays, how the carpenters thought about the problem of assembly. They are the closest thing we have to a medieval carpenter's working notes, not written in a ledger that rotted, written in the timber, in a material that, when kept dry, does not rot, does not degrade, does not forget.
And here is the thing about oak. When dendrochronologists, the scientists who read tree rings, who can date a timber by counting the annual growth rings and matching their pattern to a master sequence for that region, when they examine the oak timbers of a medieval cathedral roof, they can tell you not just when the tree was felled, but where it grew. The ring pattern carries a signature of climate, of soil, of the specific conditions of a specific valley in a specific decade. Some of the timber in the roof of Canterbury Cathedral grew, the rings suggest, in forests that no longer exist, forests that were cleared in the centuries after the building was completed. The trees are gone. The forest they came from is gone. The landscape they shaped is gone.
But the tree is in the roof, still there, still carrying its record of each year it was alive, each summer of good growth and each summer of drought, inscribed in its own body, sealed above the stone, invisible, waiting.
The cathedral you see when you stand in the nave, the soaring stone columns, the coloured light through the windows, the geometry of the vaulting that makes the ceiling look weightless, that cathedral rests on a forest, not metaphorically, structurally. The stone holds itself up through compression and arch, but above it, hidden, is wood, organic material, living material, once. 150 years of growth compressed into a function it was never designed for, performing that function still.
The master builder planned the stone, but someone, somewhere, a forest manager, a timber merchant, a carpenter who organized the procurement campaign, someone looked at a stand of oaks in the mid-12th century and thought, those will do, those are the ones, and they were right. There is a figure who appears in almost no popular account of cathedral building, not the bishop who commissioned it, not the master builder who designed it, not the glaziers, the stone carvers, the scaffolders, the mortar mixers, a figure who was essential, whose absence would have stopped the entire project before the first foundation stone was laid, and who left almost no trace in the historical record, the lime burner. Before there was mortar, there was limestone. Before there was limestone ready to become mortar, someone had to burn it. The process is not complicated to describe. It is brutal to perform. You take blocks of quarried limestone and you heap them in a kiln, a pit, or a stack, sometimes purpose-built near the construction site, sometimes a permanent feature of a quarry, and you heat them, not warm them, not bring them to a simmer. You heat them to approximately 900 degrees Celsius, and you hold them there for days, sometimes for a week. The fuel required is staggering. To produce enough quicklime for a major cathedral campaign, you might burn through entire woodlands. The lime kilns and the timber yards were in competition with each other from the beginning. The same forests that provided building timber were being stripped for fuel. Some historians of medieval construction have argued that the organization of fuel supply was as logistically complex as the organization of the stone itself, more perishable, more dangerous, more demanding of continuous attention. Because here is what happens when you get it wrong. Quicklime, calcium oxide, the product of burning, is violently reactive to water. Add too much water too fast, and it doesn't just slake, it boils. It generates heat. It can ignite organic material near it. A lime pit handled carelessly near a timber yard was not a minor hazard. The workers who managed lime were working with a substance that could blind them, burn through their skin, and destroy their lungs if inhaled as dust. They knew this without the chemistry. They knew it from experience, from injuries, from watching what happened to the man who leaned too close. Slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, what you get after controlled addition of water, was then mixed with sand and water to make mortar. The ratio mattered. The quality of the sand mattered. Sand with too much clay contamination would produce weak mortar. Sand from certain riverbeds was preferred over sand from certain other riverbeds, and the master builder knew the difference and specified accordingly. But here's what the mortar did that most people never think about. It was not simply glue. It was not holding stones together the way adhesive holds tiles to a floor. Medieval lime mortar was soft when it was laid, deliberately soft, plastic enough to absorb slight movements, to let the stones bed into position, to accommodate the inevitable micro-imprecisions of setting a shaped stone on a shaped stone under human hands, under difficult conditions. A mason, laying a course of ashlar, could press the stone down into the bed joint, feel it settle, adjust it by fractions. The mortar yielded. The mortar was cooperative. And then it hardened, not by drying out. This is the common misunderstanding. Lime mortar hardens by carbonation. The calcium hydroxide in the mortar slowly reacts with carbon dioxide from the air and converts back, over years and decades, into calcium carbonate. Back to limestone. The mortar, given enough time, becomes chemically similar to the stone it binds. This is why medieval mortar joints in a well-built wall are sometimes harder to remove than the stone itself. The mortar has turned to stone. The joint has fused. This process takes time, real time, not days, years, decades. Which means that the cathedral being built in the 12th century was still, in a meaningful chemical sense, completing its own construction in the 13th. The walls that looked finished were still hardening, still converting, still becoming what they were designed to be. The building had a lifespan that overlapped the lifespans of the people who built it, and it outlasted them still in the process of its own slow consolidation. There's a haunting quality to that. The men who mixed the mortar, who burned the lime, who got the ratio of sand to slaked lime right on a cold morning in the north of France, those men were dead before the mortar they laid had finished doing what mortar does. They got it right, and then they were gone, and the chemistry continued without them. The lime burner has no chapter in the medieval chronicles. The mortar mixer has no memorial brass set into the floor of the nave. But probe the joints of a standing cathedral wall with a careful instrument, and you find them still there, in a different sense, in the molecular structure of joints that have held for 800 years, in calcium carbonate that was once a man's labour, and a kiln's heat, and a carefully managed water addition on a specific morning, in a specific century.
The cathedral remembers the decisions that made it possible, not in language, not in record, in chemistry, in material, in the fact that it is standing, and not because the stone was strong enough alone, but because someone got the mortar right, and the mortar, silently, over a lifetime, over several lifetimes, became stone. That is what a cathedral is finally. Not just a design, not just ambition in limestone.
It is the accumulated technical knowledge of 1,000 people doing their specific job correctly, each one invisible to history, each one present in the structure, held there, sealed in, still doing the work.